And the Justice Powell's, what was the chronology there?
I clerked for Powell the year after I graduated from law school at the University of Virginia.
Virginia? At the time, was there, today there's a lot of criticism of law clerks coming from Harvard, Yale, Ivy Leagues, from the other law schools. Were you unique in the sense of Virginia?
Well, no, it's true that Harvard and Yale have a lot of clerks, but Virginia had clerks then, Virginia has clerks now. We've always had clerks in there.
What did Powell know about you when you were applying for law clerkships? Did you apply to others, or was Powell specifically yours?
Well, you've asked me a question that really is about me, more than about Lewis Powell. I actually didn't apply to him or anyone else.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that I was in the generation that went through the draft lottery.
Aha.
I lost the draft lottery, which meant that I would have been drafted on graduating from college in the spring of 1970.
Mm-hmm.
In order to avoid that, because I did not wish to serve as an enlisted man, I wanted to be an officer.
Right.
I went to the ROTC program, which I did in law school. So when I graduated from law school, I owed a year to the Army, and that meant that I was not on the regular clerkship calendar. Does that make sense?
Sure, it makes all the sense in the world. I remember the lottery. I remember those decision time periods.
So I was out of sync.
Yeah. Justice Powell's relationship with clerks generally, you came in, you're out of sync a little, so therefore a little bit older. Did you have the chance to talk to other clerks as sort of how the idiosyncrasies of how he worked at the clerks?
Well, I had spent time with him before I came in the door of the office, so he wasn't an unfamiliar person to me when I walked in to start work.
Right.
He'd been a partner at what was for that time in that city a large law firm in Richmond.
Right.
And he had, for many, many years, had young lawyers working for him. It was a relationship he found easy and knew how to manage.
Right. Justice Powell, what did you know much about him when you walked in? Was there an opportunity to research his writings? Did you kind of have a sense of his style beforehand, or did you learn it on the job?
Well, he had been appointed in October of 71 and took the position in January of 72. So he had been on the court for a relatively short time when I worked for him. Mm-hmm. And the major thing about Lewis Powell at that time was that he was new. And that he had been in private practice, and that many areas of constitutional law that, of course, became familiar to him later were not so familiar to him at that time. I knew all that, of course, because I knew he had come straight from practice to the Supreme Court, which is today very unusual.
Right. Did he feel a little bit out of sync because he was a basically corporate lawyer,
right?
Non-litigator?
Now, he would stop you if you said that to him. Okay. He had done some litigation. You are right that he was more of a transactional lawyer, but he had done some litigation, and he would have pointed that out to you.
Was that during his school board days, or I know he represented quite a bit of that, as well as...
No, as a young lawyer, he did some just regular business litigation and court work.
Yeah, sounds like me. Though I would never have stopped anybody. They would never look at me as a litigator. Lewis Powell, vis-a-vis his colleagues at the time, did he hang with anybody? Used to have the guys like Felix Frankfurter prior to him sort of run around from office to office, clerk to clerk.
The aspect of the Supreme Court that I found most surprising, and I think most people would, is how little interaction there was among the justices. They may have seen each other at lunch, but they did not in those days go from office to office or hang around. Justice Powell, I think he got along with all of his colleagues. I think he had a particular affection for Potter Stewart, and he and Justice Stewart were personal friends outside the court. He'd known Stewart before he came to the court. I think later on he had a particular affection and closeness for Justice O'Connor.
Justice Berger had just preceded him as a Nixon appointee. Then it was, as I recall, Harry Blackmun,
Right.
Powell, and Rehnquist at the same time. I think you'd mentioned that he had not, and then I've discussed really the politics behind his selection, regarding with how the background, the backstory of all that stuff. But it seemed like at the time, Powell and Rehnquist were sort of balancing it. Powell being somewhat older, Rehnquist being somewhat younger, South, non-South. Any sense of that at all?
Well, I studied that as a historian, but Powell was not on the inside of those transactions. It's clear that Justice Rehnquist's nomination made Powell's life easy. That is, if anyone was going to draw out political opposition, it was Bill Rehnquist, not Lewis Powell. And so it simplified what, in an era of highly contested and difficult confirmations, it simplified Powell's life that he was paired with Rehnquist.
We're at the Jackson Center, and as a result, we have got files on Justice Jackson, Rehnquist, and especially during the Brown versus Board of Education time period, and that whole issue of the memorandum
Right.
by Rehnquist in anticipation of the Brown decision. And that surfaced in 71, albeit later, and then it came up again in 86. Was that ever a conversation? Did you ever hear Powell comment on that whatsoever?
I don't recall any comment about it.
Yeah. It's tangential at best. Powell was somewhat involved in the Brown versus Board, having represented Virginia at that one of the cases. I think the firm did, not he did, but the firm did.
He wasn't involved in the litigation. He was certainly involved in its aftermath.
Okay.
Because he was involved in the schools in Richmond and in the state of Virginia.
Right. As I recall, ultimately they chose not to reopen some of the schools. Is that how the reaction to the decision?
That's a complicated bit of history. Virginia adopted massive resistance, and their position was they would close the public schools rather than to integrate them. When the orders were given that there were schools closed in Norfolk and in Charlottesville, and maybe in a couple of other locations, that was fairly brief, and some measure of sanity reasserted itself, and they were reopened.
Right. Was that ever a reflection when Powell looked back? Obviously, that was a time, context, 50s, and of course, much happened afterwards. But did he ever reflect on kind of that was a moment in time which it was different? Or
well, yes, Powell was very much involved in trying to steer Virginia away from extreme reactions to Brown. Involved both as the head of the Richmond School Board and also involved as a member of the sort of inner circle of Virginia, leading Virginians.
Sure.
And trying to argue against the confrontational stance that was taken by the Bourbon machine. That came up a good deal. I will tell you this, and I think I'm from the South. I don't think anyone. I think it's extremely difficult to recreate what people thought before Brown.
Sure.
Not long after Brown versus Board of Education, almost everyone agreed with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say they agreed with everything in the whole sequence of cases. A lot of people got off the train when it came to busing, but not long after Brown, enormously, I mean among educated people, enormously high approval and agreement with it.
Right.
It's hard to reconstruct the world in which that wasn't true. And I think Justice Powell had that view as well, that he looking back, that it just seemed like a very different world.
Right.
And it was.
Mm-hmm.
It changed very, well, it changed too slowly for some, but it still changed rapidly.
I know Brown versus Board 2, Justice Jackson had died by then,
Right.
and he had problems with Brown versus Board 1, not the unanimity, not the ultimate constitutional decision, but the enforcement. Because as you remember, in that first decree, there was no
Right.
enforcement provision,
Right.
knowing full well it would have tremendous impact if they did not say something. And with all deliberate speed, I think was the term, it doesn't tell you much.
No. And it's, as you know, become controversial ever since, or the court should have said that.
Exactly. I know Justice Powell had actually turned down the invitation to become a justice early on, first time through. Why was it?
Well, he had two reactions. One was that he was too old,
Yeah.
and he was too worried about being a Southerner.
Mm-hmm.
He'd seen Clement Hainsworth chewed up and spit out. Clement Hainsworth, because one of the great injustices was the pairing of Clement Hainsworth, who was an admirable, accomplished, intelligent gentleman, and G. Harold Carswell, who was, I think, none of those things.
Right.
Clement Hainsworth, whatever his reputation is among people generally in my neck of the woods, he was revered. And he was a lamb to the slaughter in the Senate, and very, in my judgment, very trivial bits of lack of clarity were exploited and magnified and made into a... Powell saw that, and he thought he was from the South, and he had been in the Richmond School Board during desegregation. It would all just be too difficult and too bloody, and he thought he was too old.
Yeah. Ultimately changed his mind.
He did.
Anybody, was there an individual or something that persuaded him, or circumstances?
Richard Nixon.
Ah.
The president told him it was his duty. He said, yes, sir.
I read someplace where Mrs. William Rehnquist turned to Mrs. Lewis Powell and said, "Isn't this the proudest day of your life?" And she said something to the contrary.
That's correct. I can't quote Joe. I have it in the book, but she said something like, "No, I feel like I want to cry."
Yeah, exactly.
She was not happy about coming to Washington. I know that sounds extraordinary, but she was not happy about coming to Washington.
I assume there was an economic burden with that. I mean,
Well, yes, but he was in a position where he could bear some economic stress.
is that right?
He was a successful lawyer.
Yeah. He was justice from 1971 through 86.
Actually took oath in January of 72.
Okay.
And then retired in 87.
Okay, so known just generally, and as you put in your book, and just as compromiser, the ability to draw consensus. Did he see himself that way? Did he see that as a role for him?
I don't think that Powell would have thought of himself. Let me say this differently. I don't think that on the Supreme Court you see a lot of action designed to maneuver the court into a position. That's kind of that talk that happens outside the court. They really work as 9 little law firms. Mm-hmm. And so it's not his relations with the other justices. It's his own mind. And his own mind was aimed toward consensus, toward practically workable solutions. He thought in terms of resolutions that everyone could live with, because he thought they were more durable and healthier.
Right.
And that was part of the secret of his great success as a lawyer.
Right.
And it was exactly the mindset he had about the Supreme Court. It wasn't an effort to bring this justice and that justice along. It was his instinct to find a pragmatic American solution. He was not an ideologically pronounced person.
Yeah. And just an aside, from what I know about Jackson, one of the reasons there is not a biography like you've done on Powell is he hasn't been able to be easily put into ideology.
The people who have the what Nino Scalia once called it in my presence, the bright, vivid colors, they are easier to write about.
Right.
And easier for people, I think, to get excited about.
Yeah. So Jackson sort of fits in somewhat the same character, pragmatic.
I think that's right. I think you can. I would make I know the sequence between Jackson and Chief Justice Rehnquist and now Chief Justice Roberts. But on an intellectual matter, in the role of the court, I might draw a line between Justice Jackson and the second Justice Harlan, mm-hmm. and Justice Stewart and Justice Powell and Justice O'Connor. That's a line of people who had commonality of approach. And it's easy to believe that if they'd all served together, they would have been genuinely collaborative.
What do you know about Justice Jackson? What's he mean to Dean John Jeffries?
I know he was a great lawyer. Mm-hmm. Of course, everybody knows about the time he spent with the Nuremberg trial. I know about his service in the Department of Justice.
It's been interesting again for us. We've had 9 years of lectures. Seth Waxman, Paul Clement, and the Greenhouse, Charles Freed just a couple weeks ago.
Those are all good choices.
Yeah, all came and talked about Jackson, the Supreme Court today,
right?
Principally the Supreme Court today, which is something. Does Virginia do that? Just an aside. Do you pause right after the term and have some scholars kind of reflect on what the heck just happened?
No, because that's after all the students have gone home. It does occur in the beginning of the academic year, which is in late August.
Because that's always, there seems to be keen interest. Of course, that's when the big marquee cases come down, and boom, right then.
Right.
Of course, the court adjourns, kids are out of school. There is kind of a void, and the folks wonder what the hell just happened.
Well, you do see those instant reviews, but not so much in law schools. They're mostly, at that time, the third-year kids are studying for the bar, and the other kids are off working somewhere.
Yeah. What's the legacy? When you got done with this book on Lewis Powell Jr., and you had interviews like this, people were talking to you about it, and they asked the question, what was the legacy of Justice Powell?
If you asked him, and on this point at least, I agree with him. he would have said his most important decision was Bakke, because it's the decision in which his individual participation was most distinctive and most influential. And the solution that he achieved in Bakke, subject to criticism from both sides, but it's essentially the still solution we're living with 40 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me to believe that it would have been the same story without him. I think that's his biggest impact. We're gonna ask one more question if you can, because I need to excuse myself.
What would that one question be? I got one question left. The question you always get asked, what would it be?
Take your pick.
During your year with Justice Powell, what did he mean to you?
Oh, I was and grew to be very close to him. I don't think that was unusual for his clerks. He was a gracious, generous, soft-spoken employer for us. But I enjoyed him quite a lot. It's hard for me to quite disentangle how I became very close with him afterwards. It was a great day in my life when I met the man. It's given me a lot of professional and personal pleasure.
When you told him, just one follow-up, then I'll let you go. When you told him you were going to do his biography, what was his reaction?
He said, fine. The important part of that was that he had to agree in advance to give me access to all of his papers without any restrictions. He did that and never looked back.
Terrific. Thank you.